mind. Therefore, in the course of a discussion like this, if you see that the case for the God of the Bible is stronger, then you have to lay the blame at the atheistic philosophy, not at the defender of that philosophy. The second idea, the idea that there are some things that are right and some things that are wrong. Are there some things that are right and some things that are wrong? Because if there are, objective moral standards demand a standard outside of human likes and dislikes. If there are objective moral standards, true right and true wrong, then there must be a God in which those standards are grounded. Now, we understand that completely. In fact, that's been understood for hundreds of years, thousands of years. When the Nazi Germans, after they had brutally massacred some 10 million people, 6 million Jews, they were on trial at Nuremberg. Robert Jackson, in his closing comments, said that they had violated crimes, they had committed crimes against humanity, and they had violated a law, and he said a law that rose above the transient and provincial. Now, where will you get a law that rises above the transient and provincial? Let me tell you where you cannot get it. You cannot get it from evolutionary atheism. It's impossible. But don't take my word for that. I'm not making a statement and then not backing it up with a fact other than just my statement. Listen to William Provine. In 1998, William Provine was invited to speak on the University of Tennessee campus at none other than Darwin Day. He just happened to say in that particular speech that he gave that if there is no God, then there is no ultimate foundation for ethics. Now listen to what Charles Darwin said. He said if there's a person who does not believe in a personal God, then, and I'm going to quote him for you, he, quote, can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest to him or which seem the best to him. Darwin said, look, if you have a guy that doesn't believe in God, then the best he can do is whatever feels the best to him, that's what he needs to do. So that means that if the atheistic communist of the Nazi Germans, if they killed 6 million Jews, that means what Darwin said was, you just do what feels the best to you. So if a person decided that it felt the best to him to kill, 6 million Jews, well, you couldn't say he ought to do any different. And if a person decided to spend the rest of his life selling everything that he had and feeding the poor, you couldn't say that he was doing right or wrong. You could simply say he was following the best impulses to him. Now, Dan understands this perfectly. In fact, let me tell you how well Dan understands this. The world's leading ethicist, according to Dan, I think it's on page 328, 314 of his book, Godless, is a man by the name of Peter Singer. Now, Peter Singer said this. In essence, he said, it's no morally different between killing a dog, a pig, or a human. Let me read the quote to you. He says, if we compare a severely defective human infant with a non-human animal, a dog or a pig, for example, we'll often find the non-human to have superior capacities. Only the fact that the defective infant is a member of the species Homo sapiens leads it to be treated differently from the dog or the pig. Species membership alone, however, is not morally relevant. If we can put aside the obsolete and erroneous notion of the sanctity of all human life, we may start to look at human life as it really is. Here's how well Dan understands that. In his book, Maybe Right, Maybe Wrong, he said human beings are part of nature. We are not better than nature, page 26. In his debate with Paul Manata, Dan said this, and I quote, in the end of the cosmos, it's not going to matter. You and I are like ants or rats or like pieces of broccoli, really. There is no value to our species. We are not any better than nature. Now, what you have heard from Dan Barker is a litany of alleged Bible contradictions. We have an answer for every one of those. Most of those are simple semantic tricks that have been played by someone who approaches the Bible with the idea of skepticism in the first place. If you noticed, if a person goes down a list in a debate of some, I think there were about 20, maybe 25 of those. 14. Well, I was counting the first 6 reasons why he said that there weren't good reasons for a God, no legitimate definition, those, etc. So that would make it right at 20. Then you can see that in a 15-minute or 10-minute debate, He's not wanting answers. There's no possible way to answer that many ideas in a 10-minute rebuttal. So what is he wanting to do? Well, I think what he's wanting to do is try to overwhelm you. You didn't even really have time to stop and think about the various individual things that he was throwing out there. And you can't blame Dan for that. It's a very good, very popular debate tactic, but we'll get to some of that in my rebuttal.
Mr. Barker, you will have 10 minutes to refute Mr. Budd's arguments.
The 6-year-old might just as well have asked God, who does he think made him? If the design of the... If functional complexity requires a designer, then the functional complexity of the mind of the designer itself, by definition, by logic, also requires a designer. If you go from a computer up to a human, you make that leap up to the human and say, look how amazing that human brain is who made the computer. By the way, some computers can outperform humans in many functions. But if you're going to make that leap and say, look at that, well, then you look at the mind of the human and say, look how amazing that is, and you make another leap up to a bigger mind that's even more complex and more organized and more functional. Why are you stopping there? If the 6-year-old is justified in asking me who do I think made me, then we skeptics are justified in asking this creator of yours, who I assume you think has a pretty wonderful brain, wonderful mind that functions, it's orderly, right? Pretty amazing. We're justified in asking the same question of that being, and we get into an infinite regress, because then we need a creator for the God who made God, right? If you can say, well, we can stop at that level, well, then why don't we stop at this level? Let's stop at the level of what we do know. We do know that in nature, complexity arises from simplicity. We do know that. The complexity of a crystal arises from the simplicity of the way molecules mathematically and geometrically can combine. We can see complexity arising around us from simpler origins. And there are many examples of that. Amino acids, and we can also show how, and Darwin basically showed us how natural selection can be the designer, not an intelligent designer, but the designer by the limited ways that nature functions, the limited ways that molecules can put together, the limited ways arithmetically that things can combine and compete. That complexity can arise from simplicity. Creationism can't do that. Creationism has to simply assume the very complexity that you are arguing for. You're saying, look at that. So your design argument falls apart logically. It is not a good answer. In Dawkins' book, he posits the Boeing 747 argument. Obviously, if there's a God, who made him? This basically is an argument from incredulity. It's not an argument from what you know. How do you connect the dots from that? How do you, suppose I agree with you. I don't know how do you explain this complexity. How do you connect the dots from that question, like when the ancients said, who made the thunder? What happened? It must be Thor. It must be Zeus. And yet now that we know more about weather, now that we know more about electricity, that gap has closed. That God has died out. You still think that science is never going to close gaps because there are unanswered questions about complexity, the origin of the original life forms. Who are you to predict that science has reached its dead end? There are no objective moral values in the universe. There are not. We make values in our brain. A value is a function of a brain that's functioning. Just like digestion is the function of the stomach, thought and value is a function of a computing brain that you admit works, right? But we make values based upon what we need to survive, what we need to enhance our lives, what we need to avoid pain in our lives. And we make comparisons of those values. When the brains die, the values go away. They don't exist. They are not things. A value is relative to an organism. But most atheists will say, and I don't speak for all atheists, most atheists will say that values can be objectively justified.